Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. Recent moves from Starbucks executives suggest the company is trying to uproot from its Seattle origins. Does it make more sense for them to stay or for them to go? Seattle Times business reporter Paul Roberts will spill the beans in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. Local tribes and indigenous-led organizations will get $5.5 million to help them adapt to climate change. The First Peoples Climate Fund is paid for through Seattle's payroll tax. One of the recipients, the Snoqualmie tribe, plans to use the grant to rebuild from last December's historic flooding and restore fish habitat. The nonprofit Feed 7 Generations got funding to help restore indigenous food sources that are resilient to climate change. Other recipients plan to use the grant money to help reduce emissions and invest in climate-friendly economic development. Seattle Parks is increasing off-leash dog enforcement. Axios reports the city will expand animal control to daily enforcement, with 2 officers patrolling parks 7 days a week. Currently, the city has only a single officer who patrols Wednesday through Saturday. Dogs are required to be leashed in nearly all public spaces in Seattle, except for areas designated as off-leash. Axios says the enforcement will primarily focus on educating the public about the rules. And Seattle Restaurant Week is back. More than 200 restaurants, bars, and food trucks are offering curated menus and fixed prices, ranging from $20 to $65. Organizers say it's a chance to support your favorite restaurants and explore some new ones. This year, it's more regional than ever, with participating restaurants in Edmonds, Issaquah, and even Bonnie Lake. And it's actually 2 weeks long, running through May 2nd. We're back with more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. Starbucks seems to be moving further and further away from its Seattle roots. Last month, the company announced that dozens of their Seattle-based corporate workforce would be relocated to Nashville. Now it seems they're moving into a building that could hold hundreds or even thousands of corporate employees. At the same time, the company continues to close stores in the city. Seattle Times business reporter Paul Roberts is here with some perspective about where Seattle fits into the company's future plans. Thanks for taking the time, Paul. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Patricia.
Do you think you can put your finger on a point where maybe the culture of Starbucks and the culture of Seattle stopped being aligned, Paul?
I mean, I bet there are probably a number of points where people certainly would have asked that. So, I don't know what your history was with the company, but, I remember in the day going into, those stores back in the 90s, and you look up at that menu of all the different coffee kinds, and it was,
Yeah.
from all over the world, right? And you kind of wanted to not screw up and make the wrong choice. Like, I really want to pick the right thing, because it was almost like you wanted to have the maximally sort of special taste that Starbucks was offering, and that you hoped you'd be able to tell the difference between, coffee from Hawaii and coffee from, Sumatra or wherever, right? And that was part of the fun of Starbucks, taking the time to kind of think, oh, geez, it was like you're doing this tasting. Seriously, every time you walked in. And I think that maybe isn't as important anymore to customers. I think they just want to go in there and get the thing they know. I think when coffee started becoming almost a dessert drink, that was much more like fast food. And maybe when it started being fast food, maybe that was a piece of it that, it kind of didn't matter where you were. They sort of set they were the folks who said, look, there are good beans out there. You don't just have to have instant coffee or drip coffee, right? And then other companies came in and said, well, we can do that better. We can sort of out Starbucks, and we can keep it on a local sort of independent scale. And we can have the experience that you used to get from Starbucks. And meanwhile, Starbucks has moved on to this more mainstream, sort of more commodified experience. And the Seattle coffee scene has sort of been taken over by other companies. And Starbucks is no longer needed for that coffee scene and no longer needs that coffee scene. It's got other fish to fry.
Let's talk about the latest news. Starbucks is shifting some of its corporate workforce away from Seattle to Nashville. What do you know about the move, and what has the company said about it?
In March, we heard that they were going to shift some of their supply chain teams to Nashville. At the time they insisted and have continued to insist that Seattle remains their corporate headquarters. The more we learned about the Nashville office, saw lease documents, and it's going to be 250,000 square feet. That's about a little under a quarter of the size of their headquarters in SoDo. It could hold anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 employees. They have around somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 employees down in SoDo. So it could hold a chunk of their current workforce. And they'd indicated, first of all, they were going to move maybe 100 or so. But they've also left open the strong possibility that they'd move other roles down there to Nashville. And so it really raises that question, how big is Nashville going to be? And what does that mean for Seattle?
Yeah. Okay, well, the company has a fairly long history here. What was Starbucks thinking all those years back?
When they started, I think Seattle happened to be the city where the three founders way back in the day wanted to set up. It had a bit of a coffee history. Seattle's Best was already an established name. The idea of upscale coffee was kind of new and exciting, I think, for not just the city, but the country, which was still very much a percolator drip, kind of place.
How much of Seattle you think was actually in that early concept beyond the location of the founders?
Starbucks is the Moby Dick character. It's very much a maritime character. They have a siren, a mermaid is their logo. My understanding is that the name was also inspired by an old mining camp on Mount Rainier that was called Starbo. It definitely had a lot of connection with Seattle. And then over the years, I think people came to see Starbucks as that company from Seattle.
Right. It's interesting. Maybe Starbucks is from Seattle, but Seattle became synonymous with Starbucks, whether or not they intended it to be that way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people were pretty proud of that. I think in the same way that folks were proud of the fact that Boeing was a Seattle company. It was kind of cool to think that this company that is transforming how the world sees coffee was headquartered in Seattle.
A lot has changed for the company since then. How has it evolved in recent years?
Well, I think, it became a global company. As a public company, it has, most of its operations and retail locations and employees, are elsewhere. A lot of its executives, the founding executives, the sort of the executive like Howard Schultz who shaped it, they've exited. And the new CEO, Brian Niccol, has brought in a team, and most of the team members are from elsewhere. They're new to the company. They're new to the city. It's kind of hard to argue it's still a Seattle company in the sense that it, is tied to the city. And I think that's also something that raises questions for folks. They look at companies like Boeing that moved their headquarters. They look at companies like Amazon that have looked elsewhere, and they wonder if that's the next step for Starbucks.
It's interesting because Starbucks is so embedded in our culture here, but from the street level, it is also a source of corporate derision often, right? People say it's a union busting company. People say, it's a target of corporate ire around here. It's a complicated relationship in some ways for the company now.
I think it bothered the company that, in their view, the city wasn't taking care of street level retail from the standpoint of regulation and minimum wage and things like that was making it harder to do business here. I mean, in their view, I think it also bothered them that from a security standpoint, if you're a store owner here, you have a retail, whether it's Starbucks or anyone else, it can be tough to do business here from a security standpoint. I think it certainly bugged them to hear the mayor-elect of Seattle urge fellow Seattleites not to drink Starbucks until they agreed to a contract. And I don't think that would have made Howard Schultz happy. And I gather it didn't also please the new leadership at the company.
Let's talk a little bit about the company and the new leader, Brian Niccol's ideas for Starbucks. What kinds of things has he changed?
Just more let's make Starbucks a place where once again you want to linger, over your coffee. There's, ceramic cups, and when they have paper cups, the baristas write little notes to you. And so that takes a lot of investment, ton of money they're having to put into store upgrades. And sort of free up some of the cash to do that, they're also making a lot of cuts. Kind of the standard thing where you're wanting to make investment, but also really save as much money as you can. So that's meant closing a lot of underperforming stores. There have been layoffs, and there's certainly a sense in the corporate Starbucks that they have got a big target on their backs in terms of, you're going to need to make cuts here in order to support some of these longer term objectives.
What does Nashville offer Starbucks that Seattle doesn't, Paul?
I mean, a couple of things. One is that you could argue that the business climate is a little friendlier down there. There's lower taxes in some respects. And then they have a really aggressive corporate recruitment program. They want to bring in employers, bring in jobs and investment, and they will offer pretty sweet tax breaks. So there's an economic benefit there. I was told that the company will avoid a substantial hit under the Washington State's fairly new state IT sales tax. That went into effect last year. So I think, broadly, the leadership can compare the two states and say Nashville makes sense from a tax standpoint. It's near an area that they want to expand their retail footprint. They've really been a coastal, well, not coastal, but sort of a coastal blue bubble, big metro company. And there's exceptions to that, obviously, but they've really, those are areas that they're familiar with. That's where they've been building stores, and they're really they know that demographic, and they haven't been as prevalent in places like the Midwest and parts of the East Coast. And so I think they're saying, that's a place for growth, but to do that, maybe we need a Nashville presence or a regional sort of location as a hub. Another question that might be worth asking is, does Starbucks want its brand to be less sort of West Coast sort of known and more neutral, where it might appeal to someone in the Midwest, someone who might look at Seattle and say, oh, that's a kind of a weird place, or there's a lot of upscale yuppie types there. You can see an argument where they'd say, let's have a more neutral city associated with our headquarters.
We started this conversation kind of talking a little bit about how Starbucks is not the only big brand that has left the Pacific Northwest. Boeing is a history here. Is this move or potential move even a Starbucks thing, or is it a signal of perhaps a bigger sentiment among businesses here?
There's this sort of narrative that the cities and the states' approach to taxes and to business regulation is helping cause companies to think about being somewhere else. And that's a very, popular take on social media. I think it's going to take a couple years of actual data to be able to see, okay, what have companies done, and have they moved their headquarters, or have they moved parts of operation where it makes sense? If you look at Amazon, for example, they said they had a big, conversation around HQ2, like splitting off. And it was about the time that they were sort of arguing with the city of Seattle over their new taxes. But they ended up doing most of their non-Seattle growth across the lake in Bellevue. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is where their tech labor pool is. It's really important to be here. You looked at Boeing, they moved their headquarters, but it was a fairly small move. Most of their sort of engineering and operation is a lot of it is here. A lot of their production is here, and so even though the headquarters is officially gone, Boeing is still very much tied to this area because of that production engineering side. If you looked at Starbucks, it's not clear exactly what would hold them here. How important is it for it to stay in Seattle? And that's a really good question. I think they probably ask that a lot. And you certainly would be able to shake up the corporate culture by moving out of Seattle and, to Nashville. So you can see a lot of different reasons why a company might want to consider that. And I think if you're an employee, you would certainly be wondering what's next.
Paul, before I let you go, when will be the next indicator of any moves on the company's part?
The Nashville office, they won't open that and move into it until next summer, so a little over a year from now. So it's not going to be anything like overnight, but they've taken 250,000 square feet of office space for 13 years. So, I mean, they're intending to have a pretty significant presence down there. And I think the one question is just what parts of the company end up moving down there, what parts stay here. And then, if it works out, do they continue just moving more and more of the company there?
Yeah, they certainly have room to make some decisions for sure, and some time. Paul Roberts, really appreciate reporting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Seattle Times business reporter Paul Roberts. Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thanks to our generous donors for your support. We'd never abandon our Seattle roots. Rest assured, we're staying right here. Show your hometown Seattle Now pride by giving us a rate or review on your favorite podcast app. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Vaughn Jones, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tonight for Evening Headlines.